across North Carolina and other portions of the South. Moses was in charge. Historical accounts contend that the slaves of masters engaged in non-agricultural occupations tended to have more liberties and be treated more humanely than those who spent their days toiling in the fields. The artisan enslaved were of greater value, worth almost twice as much as field hands, and in much demand. While entertainments like Gone with the Wind and Roots have painted a picture in our mind's eye of vast plantations filled with dozens or even hundreds of slaves bent over endless fields of cotton, numerous historical accounts claim that slavery in North Carolina bore little resemblance to these portraits. North Carolina's slavery was smaller in scope. Yeoman farmers working their relatively small plots alongside the handful of slaves they might own if they owned any at all. Such closeness tended to create more humane living conditions for the enslaved. Sometimes when I visit one of the sites my company, McKissack & McKissack, is constructing now, I try to imagine what it might have been like for Moses to move around the South with his crew 200 years earlier. A slave unaccompanied by his master, nervously trying not to draw the suspicion and ire of every white man he encountered. While the fears of whites and the risk of the violence their fears might trigger were always wafting through the air, the peculiarity of slavery allowed for a wide variance in the treatment of black people. For instance, slaves in Wilmington were given so many liberties that it wasn't unusual for them to use funds they gained from hiring themselves out to rent houses and tenements for their families. However, by 1823, the North Carolina legislature cracked down on the practice of self-hire, declaring it illegal. More common was the master hiring out his slaves to others who were in need of laborers. According to historian John Hope Franklin, the newspapers carried advertisements of slaves for hire, and not infrequently the masters sent the enslaved worker into town to earn money during the dull seasons. Since many masters in antebellum North Carolina worked side by side with their slaves, they felt that they knew them and had the problem of discipline well in hand, wrote Franklin. When the slaveholder clamored for more restrictive legislation, it was for the purpose of bringing his neighbor's slaves under the surveillance of the law rather than his own. Under these circumstances, it is not difficult to conceive of a situation in which many slaveholders refused to enforce the law in regard to their own slaves, which resulted in a general laxity of law enforcement over a large area. In fact, so many slaves were fleeing the more brutal form of bondage practiced in the neighboring states of Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia that the North Carolina legislature in the early 1800s passed laws more carefully regulating the militia and slave patrols and circumscribing even further the activities of slaves, according to Franklin. But there still were well-known examples of slaves in North Carolina who were given liberties seen by just a tiny number of their contemporaries. One of the best known of these was George Moses Horton, a slave owned by a farmer in Chatham County named James Horton. George spent much of his time on his master's farm, tending to the corn and wheat crops. But when George desired, his master allowed him to hire his own time, meaning he paid the master 50 cents for a day of freedom. Beginning when he was about age 20, he used his free time to travel the 8 miles from the farm to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. George, who had taught himself to read when he was a child, sold poems to students that he wrote incorporating the names of their sweethearts, charging 25, 50, or 75 cents per piece. He did this for several decades, becoming a beloved figure on campus. He had an especially enthusiastic fan in Caroline Lee Hentz, a novelist and professor's wife, who helped him publish his first printed poem in her hometown newspaper in Massachusetts,
To keep listening to this audiobook for free, click the link in the description. It will take you to a free Audible trial where you can listen to this and many other books for free for 30 days.